Hi guys, and welcome back to another video tutorial here on David's PC channel. This is the third part of the Introduction to Blender series, and technically also the second part of this scene, in which I'm going to show you how to render the scene in Blender using the Cycles render engine, and that also means including adding materials, so you can get a render like this. Now in this reference scene which I did, that you can notice that the buildings are slightly different, but we're going to be using the buildings we created in part 1 of this sort of small semi-series to create these materials, so I can show you guys how the basics work. And now, since we are going to be using the Cycles render engine, I am quickly going to explain how a ray trace render engine works, what are the advantages and disadvantages of that. So I'm just going to jump into Paint and going to do a very little demonstration for you guys of how a ray trace render engine works. And basically, let's just imagine this is a world. So we have a light source over here, which is the sun. That's the most general known light source. And excuse my drawing skills, I'm using a mouse and it's all I got. And sorry, that's my antivirus. So basically, we have rays that come from the sun, which is sunlight, like so. And let's say there would be a glass object here, like a window or something like that, and then the ray changes. So part of it reflects and part of it refracts, like so, on the other side of the material. And there's physical rules that depend on the material itself and the ray and everything and how it changes. But so basically, let's say it was like that, and then there's a big object right here. And then that ray will actually, even if the object is not glossy, the ray will bounce back off of this object just a little tiny bit. And let's say over here we have our human eye, horrible eye, or in the case of Blender we have a little camera. And so basically what a ray trace render engine does is it calculates all of this. And there we come to the first disadvantage. It is very slow. Now, it's not very slow, and depending on what kind of computer you have, you can actually take advantage of your graphics card when rendering, but generally it is much slower than a conventional render engine. But the advantage is that since this is the way the world works, the results are going to be much more realistic. And that pretty much covers what I wanted to show here a little bit, but in case you didn't know, that's how Ray Trace Render Engine works. So now I'm gonna show you how to jump from this to this in Blender using kind of this as a material reference. So let's get to it. In Blender, this is a scene where I last left you. We have our different individual buildings, and yeah, so let's just get to it. Pretty much what we're going to do is we're going to isolate one building. So we're just going to click on this layer and then shift click the next layer. And I'm going to quickly turn on screencast so you can see that, which was just in the settings over here, so you can see what I'm doing. Basically, we're going to just click on having the building selected. We're going to go over here in the Properties tab, but to add materials. But before that, what we want to do is we want to switch to the Cycles render engine, because by default, the render engine is Blender Render. And you can see this up here. The way you switch it, you click on Cycles. If you don't have Cycles, up here in the drop-down list, go to File, User Preferences, go to Add-ons, type Cycles. And if you see this and it's unchecked, check it. And if you don't see this, get a newer version of Blender. That's, the general rule. So now once we've switched to Cycles, you'll see a couple of settings here change, and that's all good so far. But for now, let's just click on Materials, hit New, call it Building Red, because you always want to call it something sensible in case you have to reuse that material. And going back to our reference quickly, you can see that the building itself is just red. Then we have these kind of like see-through partially windows or floors, and then we have kind of glossy. You can only see that they're glossy because it's the same material up here, and these are glossy, kind of glossy black radio fins. So basically, we just want to add the main red of the building, call that building red. And the way Cycles works is there's shaders, and shaders have different characteristics. There's diffuse, which is basically a solid color. And I'm sorry, Blender seems to be doing that. Sometimes I'm hiding these windows. I'm going to close Blender and start it back up. That should solve the problem. I'll be right back. Okay, so like I said, shutting down Blender and starting it again did solve the problem. So what I was saying about shaders is that there's different shaders. So there's the diffuse shader, which is basically just a solid color. There's a glossy, which, like it says, is glossy, so it reflects. There's glass, which is basically transparent on some occasions and glossy on other. There's translucent, which lets through light, but not really lets you see through them. Transparent, which lets you see through the object as well. Velvet, which is kind of a fabric style, smooth type material. Emission, which is basically a light. Holdout, which is nothing. In that sense, just a black. Mix shader is you can mix two of them together. An add shader, you can basically just add shaders like so. But basically what we're going to use here is just a diffuse shader, and the diffuse shader we're just going to make a nice little deep red, make it a little bit darker, and this is just a color wheel with RGB values, and you can change the darkness here. Just give it a red like so. And the way we can see to which part we're adding the materials actually is in the viewport here, and this is the viewport. Hit material, and you'll see that the entire building shows up as red. And actually we can make the timeline a little bit smaller, actually get rid of it all the way, so we have slightly more space here. So basically we see that everything is red, but we don't quite want everything red, so we're just going to go into edit mode, go into face select mode, and select these four rings, or these pop-outs, and we're going to create a new material and call that building red, and call them fronts or something like that, something that lets you recognize them again. And let's make this a mix shader, so we can mix two shaders together. And in my reference, which I'm going to pull up here, you can see that it's sort of see-through right here with the hillside, but then again it's not. And so what I did for that is I actually mixed a transparent with a translucent shader, and at just factor 0.5, which means that they're both the same amount. All the way to 0 would mean that we have all of the first shader, and all the way to 1, and you can simply change this by clicking here and then sliding. All the way to 1 would mean all the way translucent. So basically that's it. And we're gonna make this to 0.5 again and make them a red color just like before, maybe slightly less intense like so. Just make sure it doesn't really get into the pink tone. And the way you can copy this color to down here is just hover over it with your cursor, hit Control C to copy and Control V to paste, and that's just the default copy paste in Windows. If you have a Mac, I suppose it's your Command C, Command V, but I don't have a Mac, don't quote me on that. And so that's the material, but now we can see that it's still the good old red. Now that we have this selected in edit mode and we have the material selected, we can hit assign, and you'll see that the material of only the faces selected will change. If I now go out of edit mode and object mode, you can see that everything, so there's the deep red in between and there's still the red here. Now moving on to our little radio towers in the top here, and the easiest way to actually select all these faces is to go into orthographic, just a view like so, go into wireframe mode, and then select these faces just like so. Make sure we don't get the ones in between. And now you can see that if we go back to our camera view, we can see that they're all selected all the way around. Now we jumped out of the material mode, just go back to material. Now that we have those selected, let's add a new material and call it glossy black. This time change from a diffuse to a glossy shader, and the roughness basically means if it's at 0.000, it doesn't exist in nature. So if you want something to be extremely glossy, just out of practice set it to 0.001, or just, I don't know, that's what I learned. So I'm actually going to set this to 0.01, which is still going to be extremely glossy, and let's just grab a black here. By not changing the little dot in the middle, we just get black or white to black. So we can basically just grab a dark gray. Also never choose a complete black, because once again that doesn't exist in nature, so just choose a dark gray. And again, assign those values, and now we have our first building complete. And now we can actually also set up a light for our scene, which we're going to need to render, because like I explained before, there has to be a light source for any of the rays to work. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to go to the layer where we have our landscape and just go to object mode so it doesn't look so dark. And with our cursor in the middle still, we can actually check that by Shift S and then cursor to center, so it was in the center. Let's add a new plane. And excuse me, after I restarted Blender, I forgot to turn my screencast back on, so I'm going to do that now. We have the plane added. Let's just move it up to about here, make it much larger, move it out of the view like so, and we can actually just go into a perspective, user perspective like this, and move it around a little bit, because as you can maybe even tell in my reference image, the light, especially here in reflection, came a little bit from the right, from about up here. So I'm going to do that again. We're going to just go to about so, and for this, it doesn't have to be exact. We can move it down, rotate it a little bit like so, maybe a little bit more like so. So that now, in general, if this is our camera, we'd have the light shining in from behind, a little bit maybe like so. Now this is all very improvised. There's not really a rule for any of this. So you can see the light will shine down from this direction to down here. Now that we have the light set up, we have to give it a material as well. Give it a new material, call that light, and simply choose emission. And once again, it's going crazy. So give me a second while I restart Blender. Okay, I'm back, and once again it's just fine. So for emission, basically we can change the color and the strength. We can just leave this at default for now. We might have to play with the strength a little bit in the future. Now if we bring back our first building, like so, we can actually render this out quickly. And to only do a selection of your camera, you hit Shift B, and you get just a box, which you can just, for now we just selected the building like so. It's a good practice to save right before you start a render. And basically we have our light, we have just our landscape, we have our building, we've added materials to the building, and the landscape doesn't have a material, and as you can see in my reference, it's just a neutral gray. Let's give it that neutral gray again. That's a material I like to call clay, which I use just as test materials if I only want to look at or analyze the objects, which is a mixed shader of with a 0.2 or 0.15, usually actually 0.15 of a diffuse and a glossy. The diffuse is just a white like so, and the glossy with a roughness of 0.1, which is relatively rough, same color, and this just gives it a little bit more light in the scene than if it were a pure diffuse, because it bounces the light rays around a little bit more, gives it a little bit more definition, and it's a great just material to test the render if you don't you're just in the middle of building a model and you don't want to have to create a complex material yet. So basically we've added the material to that. We have our selection, which is the red box. And the way to render is, again, save it and hit F12. And what happens is, actually here you're going to start seeing that there's a sample count, and as each sample progresses, it becomes better. It becomes less noisy and there's less fireflies. Fireflies are just these light, bright little dots, but there's not really a whole lot of them right here. It's just still quite noisy. Now, as the samples progress, it will become less noisy. And so you can already see that there's this semi-translucency to this material here. We can see the building kind of on the inside, and there's also the black glossy material on these radio towers. Now you can see that it's quite slow, and we're only at 10 of 10 samples. And basically this is quite usual, and since we only have a selection, it just creates the rest as black. So we can just zoom into this a little bit. And now I'm going to quickly get you through some render settings so we can kind of optimize this. Notice that the time it took was 45 seconds. So let's just with escape, we can get back out of it. Let's go to the render settings. And the first important thing is resolution. The lower the resolution, obviously, the faster the render. But without having to change the resolution of our camera, we just set this to 50% and it will render at half the resolution, which is good, which is just fine for test renders. Then also we can just close this one, close stamp, grab sampling and maximize this. And what you'll notice is there's, for a render, we have 10 samples. Let's set this to 100, which means that in a final render it will recalculate the rays 100 times and improve the quality. The preview number of samples is basically, if I were in the viewport right now, where instead of material to choose rendered, it would actually render, in this case, only our selection as it progresses. And as you can see, it was very fast doing that. If I quickly jump out of that again, go into rendered, you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, it does render that quite quickly. You can also change this to be higher. If you have, for example, your graphics card rendering, then that would be just fine by setting this to 100 and this to 1000 or so. For final works, I recommend at least 100 samples, preferably more if you can handle it, and if you have lots of lights or translucencies, set it higher. And then for light paths, which is basically where you can control those light paths, which I explained in the beginning how they work. There's the diffuse, which is still object, glossy, and transmission. They all are self-explanatory. Basically, just go for direct light, which is extremely conservative when it comes to computing power, which should render much faster. So now that we've divided the resolution by 2 and we've kind of adapted these light paths, just for all intents and purposes, I'm going to switch this back to 10 samples in render and preview as 10 as well, and save Blender. I'm going to re-render the selection I showed before, and we're going to compare times just to show you guys that what I showed you how to change here does make a difference. I'll be back in a second. Okay, so it finished rendering and it took 6 seconds while, and I actually put this in a different slot, render slot, while the first one here, actually this took 38 seconds. This time I re-rendered it just to show you guys the comparison. Now you can see that there are more pixels, there's a higher pixel density than in the slot 2 here. Right here you can see it doesn't look as good, but it's fully sufficient for a test render for basic materials. So I kept all those changes. Let's actually set the samples in render back to 100, and we can keep going with our different buildings. So by just hitting escape, you come back out of that. So let's just grab our second building as well, which is our little dome figure. And for that, it's actually, the material is quite simple. Let's just go again to the materials tab, add a new material, and call it I don't know, dome building. Dome building works. Basically, we want the wall to just be just a diffuse white. That's fine. But then the kind of the top part here, the dome itself, or the hemisphere, whatever, observatorium, whatever it may be, we want to be a glossy black. You can actually see in the reference here, you can see the reflection of the light nicely. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to just hover over it and hit L, which selects all of the connected or linked vertices and thus faces. So while having those selected, we're going to add a new material. We're going to add a new material in the list up here for this object, but we're not going to hit new to create a new material. But we're going to go to the drop down list here and grab our glossy black, hit assign, and if we go back to the materials view, we'll now see building is white. This is glossy, or this is black. We can't tell it's glossy yet, but now this is the same material as here. So if I change anything here, it will actually change the material for both the objects, which is great if you have many similar objects in your scene. And that was pretty much it for the second building. I'm not going to do a test render for this one. So let's jump to the third. What do I have on? These are the foundations. Okay. Third building. Going back to our reference quickly, you can see that it's a light blue or gray, kind of a glossy material for the main. Then there is a glass, and it's hard to tell, but there's kind of a transparency in the top part here. There's a glass rim or glass just view, and then once again the glossy black radio antenna dishes things. You know, I haven't really found a sophisticated name for those, but basically those are the materials we're going to add to the tower as well. Jumping into here. As you can tell, I'm kind of skipping over things a little bit faster because they basically repeat. Basically, add a new material, just call this Tower Blue. Once again, we're going to give it a mix shader, similar to the clay object, or clay material actually. we're going to grab a diffuse, and we're going to grab a glossy. We can actually mix them at about 0.15, just like the clay material. The diffuse will set to just a light blue, maybe like so. The glossy, again with Control C and Control V, we're going to copy the same value into the glossy. And we're going to make the roughness 0.1. Actually, as this has turned out, actually we're going to make this lower. Let's make it 0.05. I guess that should be a good value. It is actually pretty close, or pretty much exactly the same as the clay material. We could have just copied that and edited. But anyways, so now that we have the main building, or the main material, sorry, done, we're going to just jump into edit mode. Again, select this rim, and if we go to camera view, we can see that actually, since we added loop cuts here, this as well as this are still part of the same surface, so don't forget to select those as well. Grab a new material, call this tower glass. As for the material for this one, we're actually just going to grab the default glass material. Now, there are many disadvantages to this material. It creates fireflies, it's not very accurate, and so on and so forth, but it does the job for now. We just assign that, and we're actually going to give it a slightly blue tinge as well, just like so, just to keep in tone. Now, you can see that in the material view, there's also this difference. Again, for those satellite dishes, which we added up here, we're going to again go into just an orthographic view like so. And then with the box select tool, which you can get it with B, we're going to just select those dishes. Just go back to camera view for the ease of seeing. And we're going to add new material kind of for this object, or for the tower in this case. From the drop down list, grab our glossy black and assign the material. And now if we go to material, we can see that we pretty much have created all the materials for the buildings. Now we want to add the materials for our foundations, so for these blocks. And now what's important to know is, we're actually going to get rid of the camera selection. What's important to know is I am actually going to be using an image texture for this. And I can quickly show you guys the image texture just by going into UV image editor, hitting X here, and then image open, and this is in, actually give me a second, sorry about that, I was just kind of testing out something for myself. Anyways, we're going to be using this material for our foundations, and the way we're going to get this material onto these blocks is by just giving them a new material, call that foundation. And under diffuse, where you can see color, there's a little button on the right. We're just going to click image texture, and we're going to, from drop down menu, because I opened it before in Blender, we're going to grab a concrete bear, and these are all textures off of CG Textures. You can sign up there, they've got great textures, and this one also happens to be tiled, which means if I add further images next to each other, they will all match up nicely, and I will see that it just appears as gray. And now the reason for that is because we have to UV unwrap it. And what UV unwrapping does is basically it takes this object and it makes it flat. And we can actually help this process by marking seams. And what this basically allows, this allows Blender to cut the object at where we marked seams. And we're going to mark these by hitting Control E and then mark seam. Select everything, hit U, and then just unwrap. And this will create just a UV unwrap. And you can see down here, these are the four, let's select it like this. These are the four faces here. And these are the two side faces, which are those. And just by having everything like this, we can actually now, if we jump back into material view, you can see that we have applied the texture, but it does seem very large. So what we're going to do is we're just going to scale this up so it does appear slightly smaller on the foundation. And now we're just going to add the this material to the other ones, which is foundation, and to this one. And we're going to have to unwrap those as well, if I could find it. So again, go into edit mode, edge select mode, and select these edges like so. So these four that are in the ring like this will make the long stretch, and these are just the side ones. You know, this is kind of like little games you used to play. You know, cut it up and stick it back together. I don't know, in kindergarten, at least I did. And again, unwrap this. Quickly check if it worked. Yes, we do have a scaled version. And then here we're just going to do the same thing again. I think yes, this is right. Control E to mark the seams and unwrap it once again. And now, if we go to material, you can see that they're all just fine. But now, since we did change the scale of this one, we're gonna have to change the scale of the other ones as well, just so they match about. Actually, this one's fine because it's the smallest foundation. So yeah, those materials are fine. Now, if we grab back our landscape and all of our three buildings, we are now ready for a render. But actually, before that, jumping back to the reference image, you can see that the background is quite dark. And the way to do this, and if we actually went to quickly here our render result, you can see that the background here is very, very light. So the way we're going to change that is by going to the world settings over here, click on use nodes, just a background color, and just make this darker. As simple as that. Save it, save your file, and render it out, and I'll be back when it's done. Okay guys, so I'm actually back. We're at sample 12, about 30 seconds have passed, and I noticed two things. So the first being that actually the textures on the concrete should be slightly smaller, as well as in the background could be slightly darker, and the camera perspective could be slightly higher or kind of slightly more face down. And it's good because this is still at our test render settings. Afterwards we're going to change the settings and do a final render, which we can then compare to the first one. So yeah, basically we're going to make those changes. Just cancel the render with escape and go back out. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to jump into each of these foundations and just slightly scale them up. Sorry, I just canceled that. Scale this one up as well a little bit more, and this one too. Now that they're all scaled up, they should look slightly finer, slightly larger in dimension. Again, we'll go to the world settings and make the background just a little bit more dark, like so. And the last thing we want to do is just grab the camera, move it up on the z-axis just a little bit so we can see a little bit more of this building, and then with Shift F, like I showed you before, just move down the perspective a little bit. So yeah, pretty much these are the changes. Save it again, and we're going to go back to the render settings, crack this up to 100%, which is 1920 by 1600 resolution, and under render, under these light paths, we still have samples at 100. Under light paths, from direct light, switch to a limited global illumination, which will just create a slightly more detailed and more realistic render result. You know, the more bounces, the more true it is to nature, because there it basically bounces indefinitely. You know, using the word indefinitely very lightly for any physician that is watching, but yeah, pretty much. So we can limit these, and these are we can just work with the defaults here. And now that we've done those changes, I'm going to do one final render, and I'll be back when that's done. And yeah, that's pretty much going to cover the tutorial. So I'll see you guys in a second. Okay guys, the foundation is turned up pink, and I have no idea why. I might have just quickly jumped to the wrong material or changed something. So why are those the way they are? That makes no sense at all. Okay, for some reason the image textures have been disabled. Yeah, no reason, no idea why I did that. I must have clicked something. So let's do our final render now. See you in a second. Okay guys, so while this is rendering, I'm going to quickly interrupt and give you guys a little tip on how to calculate your render time, and a little bit say something about render times. So basically we're at sample 29 and we're at 6 minutes 06. So 6 times 60 is 360, plus 6 is 366. You punch it into a calculator and divide that by the sample, so that would be 29, and you get a number 12.6 seconds per sample. Multiply that by the amount of samples, 100, and divide it by 60 to get a minute count, and possibly by another 60 if you wanted to get an hour count. And that's actually, so it should take about 21 minutes in total, with 6.5 minutes passed. And what I said before about hour count, believe me, you will be rendering scenes that take hours to render, possibly even days if you're doing an animation or an extremely complex scene. Now this scene, like calculated, should only take about 20 minutes or so, but as you can see, there's a lot of lag already going on in the picture, because it does use 100% of your computer. And also, in addition to that, if you have extremely complex scenes with loads of reflections and many small objects with millions or tens of millions of vertices or faces, then you're going to run into some very long render times. And this is not really a warning or really telling you not to do it, because it is worth it, and you can render overnight perfectly fine with, hopefully if you don't have a loud computer, you can sleep nicely. But just kind of, that's what I have to say about render times. And don't be completely surprised if it does take a long time to render, especially ray trace render engines, like mentioned in the beginning of the video, do take their time. And so yeah, that's pretty much it. I'll see you guys when it's done. Okay, so the render finished with a time of 22 minutes and 56 seconds, and it's very slow. It's not a complex scene, but it took its time, and actually it took slightly longer than expected, because I was listening to some music while it was rendering, and that did slow it down a little bit. So always keep that in mind, how much horsepower your computer got and how much it can actually use, because if you're doing other things, then of course it's going to get slowed down. Quickly, also something to say about the glass material, which you can see right here, is it does sometimes get very funny, in that sense that you'd think that it's a mix of reflection and looking through it, so transparency, but it's actually not, because it actually calculates all different sorts of things, including index of refraction and all of that. So you can either master that or find ways around using the glass material. But other than that, all of the other materials have turned out quite well. This is not meant to be photorealistic or extremely accurate or anything. We even got the chance to kind of do a slight introduction into UV textures, so using image textures and then unwrapping the objects to make them flat in that sense. And then also in comparison to our reference image, which is much more transparent, you can see that there has been kind of a difference. But you can still kind of slightly see the curvature of the hill and also down here. So it is still slightly transparent. So basically, this is the point where I'm out of words and out of things to say. So thank you for watching, and be sure to come back for more video tutorials on Blender. I'm thinking of doing a kind of like a still art style render, possibly something kind of like exterior and vegetation, and definitely I'm going to be doing one on how to create trees using a tool called Arboro. So stay tuned for those. Thank you for watching, and take care.